This is Lars. Thanks again for checking out my podcast. Enjoy your day and the show, and let's make America great again. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's the day we call Conspiracy Theory Thursday, and it's my pleasure to be with you for a little bit of honestly provocative talk radio. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. I'll get to our Twitter poll question. You're going to like this one in just a moment. But I want to ask you this question first. Is our election system in America safe and secure from foreign influence? I got to tell you something. I don't think it is. And I haven't thought that for a long, long time. And I think, if anything, unlike almost everything else that's based on technology, most things based on technology get better, not worse. But when it comes to elections, very much based on technology, even if you're still marking a paper ballot, it's counted by machines with computers. It's added up with machines and computers. It is stored on information that is usually silicon instead of gray matter between somebody's ears. So consider this report from Fortune. Iranian hackers broke into a system used by a U.S. city government to publish election results in 2020. They were discovered by cyber soldiers operating abroad, not even here at home. And they were kicked out before an attack could be launched. That's the word coming from U.S. military and cybersecurity officials. The system involved in the previously undisclosed breach. In other words, we're only hearing about this about 3 years later. The system involved was not for casting or counting ballots, but was used to report unofficial election results on a public website. But remember, they're getting into the computer systems at all, and they're not doing it here at home. They're doing it overseas. This breach was revealed during a presentation this week, again, according to Fortune, at a conference in San Francisco that focuses on cybersecurity. If they had not been expelled from the site, the hackers could have altered or otherwise disrupted the public-facing results page, though without any effect on the actual ballot counting. But let me tell you something. I see an effect here that goes outside of cybersecurity. Consider this. You have the county's own system saying the vote count is X, but when you look at the actual results, it's Y. One of the things we have to trust in any election system is we have to trust that the results are true results. We certainly got a lot of that during the 2020 election and even during the 2022 election. We would see results reported, and then people saw numbers go backwards. And you say, how does a number go backward in an election unless somebody is messing with it? In other words, even if all they were able to hack was the system that reported the results to the public, the minute you tell the public the election is going left, and then you find out the election actually went right, it diminishes, it degrades, it could destroy people's trust in the elections. And if these hackers were able to get into the public system, the one that reports the results, is there anything that would necessarily stop them from getting inside the system that actually counts the ballots? And if they could do both, they could make people believe that an election came out one way instead of another way. And do you think that the Iranians are glad that Joe Biden was actually elected president? I think they're thrilled because Donald Trump was putting some pressure, a lot of it, on the Iranians. He was saying to them, we're going to keep you under sanctions until you agree that you're not going to be building nuclear weapons. That old Obama deal that he cut, the one where he never submitted it as a treaty to the United States Senate as required for treaties, Obama cut a fraudulent deal that allowed the mad mullahs of Tehran to be able to continue down their path toward a nuclear weapon. Donald Trump put that to a stop. Now, did that stop their nuclear arms program? No, but we were this close to getting there because at the point where Joe Biden came into the White House, the Iranians, economically speaking, money-wise, they were down to breathing fumes at that point. They were really in tough shape. They were in exactly the right spot where the U.S. government could actually say, we want you to change what you're doing, because they had put enough pressure on them. So what did Joe Biden do? He took all the pressure off because, well, I think Joe Biden is one of the best assets that Iran has, as well as being a great asset to Ukraine and to Moscow and to Beijing and a lot of other places that have nothing to do with making America better again. In any case, glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Again, naysayers always go to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Let me tell you what's coming up this hour, and then I'll get to the Twitter poll. Has Joe Biden's army of unelected bureaucrats implemented and enforced just as many laws as the politicians have? And if you say, well, the federal bureaucracy is not supposed to be writing laws, those are bureaucrats. They're not elected. They're not accountable. You can't get rid of them if you're unhappy with the result. Yes, we'll talk about that. Under the Biden regime, 85,000 illegal alien children have been simply lost. That was the testimony before the U.S. Congress last week, that they have 85,000 children. You remember that the Biden administration has not hesitated to say about Donald Trump, well, he locked kids up in cages. And then Trump had to remind them the cages were actually invented by Joe Biden and his boss, Barack Obama. But then they said, you haven't done right by these kids. Why? 500 of them have not been reunited. And boy, the mainstream media loved that story. They said, oh, Donald Trump has not reunited 500 kids. And yet today, we've got actual sworn testimony before the U.S. Congress that 85,000 children of illegal aliens. I agree with you if you say, well, the kids had no choice about being taken here. They were dragged across the border by parents or by adults who were trying to traffic them. The idea that the Biden administration now admits it has lost track of 85,000 kids. If you were worried about the kids not reunited with their parents under Donald Trump, I think you should be really worried about 85,000 kids they can't find. Because as we know, Joe Biden has been one of the biggest boons for child trafficking that anybody has ever seen on planet Earth. I do not believe that is an exaggeration. Joe Biden's administration has made possible the illegal entry of 7 million illegal aliens and many, many children who were brought across the border not for legitimate or loving reasons. They were brought across the border so that they could be trafficked. I also want to mention this. He's sort of in my business, although I never met the man. Famed talk show host Jerry Springer has now died. We got the word he was 79 when he passed away. He had cancer. The host of the Jerry Springer Show, and many of us remember that somewhat fondly. It was a little bit of a freak show. He passed away peacefully at his home in Chicago on Thursday today. And that is a sad note because Jerry Springer certainly livened things up. And violent crime continues to surge across the United States. The most recent report shows that murder rates have increased 10% in America's largest Democrat-run cities. And U.S. Air National Guardsman Jack Teixeira, accused of leaking classified documents online. That came down just a couple of weeks ago. He may still have access to classified materials, and federal prosecutors are saying you can't let this guy out of custody. That would be bad for the United States. Glad to be with you on a Thursday. Our Twitter poll, should we require that all military vehicles be all electric within the next 6 years? I'd say no to that. Vote on our Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. So during Donald Trump's time as president, America's economy was performing like it was on steroids. Great growth, fantastic employment for every single demographic group, every age group, every racial group, every even sexual preference group. It was all going very, very well. And then COVID hit. And I don't think anybody expected us to get out of that, even if the government's actions had not been so over the top in so many places. But we knew we were going to take a hit from that. The question now is, can we get back somewhere to near normal numbers and near normal growth? The latest numbers don't seem to support that idea. Ryan Young joins me now, who's a senior research fellow with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Ryan, welcome back to the program. And are we going the right direction with the latest numbers showing pathetic 1.1% growth?
Hey, Lars. Yeah, it's the price of stimulus today is a slowdown tomorrow, and right now it's tomorrow. I mean, you nailed it with the story of COVID. We had a healthy economy that was hit by a pandemic, and it opened up on its own somewhat, but Washington's overreaction between $5 trillion of new spending bills and the Fed growing the money supply by 40% and causing today's inflation, there's a price to be paid for that. And while it's nice that the economy is still growing at 1.1%, during good times, it's at least double that, and sometimes it's over 3%. So could be worse, but could be better.
Well, and to the extent that the that all that stimulus, whether needed or not, I think a lot of it was completely unneeded. Because it was shoveled out just sort of indiscriminately. I mean, I remember getting calls from people who said, I got a stimulus check. My wife and I are still both working. We're considered essential. What should I do with it? And I said, well, I guess you could send it back to the Treasury, although I think that's kind of a waste of time and money, because sending it back, they're not going to apply it to the national debt or anything like that. I said, or you can just stick it in the bank against future hard times, because they're probably going to come. Now, I don't know if that was good economics advice, Ryan. I'd leave that to you. But it was just shoveled out indiscriminately. But if you consider it sort of like drinking a little bit of poison, not enough to kill you, but enough that it's going to, as you said, today's stimulus is tomorrow's bad news. How long do we have to suffer from the bad news before we can get back on the straight and narrow, assuming that the government doesn't keep doing these kinds of things and shoveling out monies to people?
I'd guess at least through the end of the year. The Fed is meeting next week to make another interest rate decision. And the right thing to do is for them to raise rates again. And frankly, their interest rate that they control, the federal funds rate, that's still actually below the rate of inflation. It's below zero in real terms. That's not good. So as much as people are complaining about the Fed tightening things up, we actually still have an expansionary monetary policy, and they need to get that above the inflation rate, so it's above zero in real terms. So there's still more to do. Things are moving in the right direction, but they made mistakes, and there is going to be a price to pay one way or another. We can have inflation for a long time, or we might risk having a recession. It's one or the other. Choose your bad.
I got to tell you something, Ryan. When I have a Band-Aid that needs to be pulled off, I tend to want to just yank it off. Are you telling me that from an economist standpoint, it'd probably be smarter to rip the Band-Aid off by saying, let's just put the interest rate to the rate of inflation, and that they would take the medicine. The medicine's gonna taste bad, but we'll get over it faster?
Yeah, I mean, low inflation or low interest rates also encourage imprudent risk-taking. There's a certain amount of risk that's good, and if you go beyond that, that's bad. We've had artificially low interest rates, a matter of public policy, for a long time now, and that's led to things like the Silicon Valley Bank disaster and many others. So the sooner we get interest rates back up to where they should be, to a more realistic level, the better economic decisions people will make, and the better the long-term economic health will be, and the lower the inflation rate will be. It's not going to go down until people believe that the Fed is serious about getting things down. So we're lucky that the GDP report came in positive, because that should give the Fed some of the political courage that it needs to keep doing the right thing.
Yeah, do the right thing. But I got to ask you, am I right if I read this signal as what either Biden and his administration will do or won't do? When they come out with this plan that actually rolls in about 4 days on the 1st of May, and they say, we've got a great idea. Let's charge people with really good credit more so we can charge people with really bad credit less on home loans. Does that sound like an administration that is going to take the economic medicine and send the right signals to people about making prudent decisions, or not?
No, I mean, if anything, if you have good credit ratings, skip a few payments so you can get a better rate.
I actually wonder if you could make that pen. I've kind of thought sarcastically to say, hey, if you got good credit now, like you said, run up one of your balances, miss a few payments, and say, I'm looking for that 1.75% interest rate drop on a home mortgage that the people with good credit don't get, and the people with bad credit do get. I mean, when you've got a government that engineers things so that people actually have a positive incentive to do negative economic things, does that bode well?
No, it's a terrible idea, and it makes the Fed's job harder. They've already done the hard part as far as getting the money supply back in line. They still have a little work to do on the interest rates. Now it's credibility. Inflation is what happens when you print too much money, and even if the Fed is doing the right thing, the administration and Congress are not making things any easier between their spending binge and between shenanigans like they're doing with credit ratings. They're making the Fed's tough job even tougher. And as long as they keep doing that, the public is going to say, maybe there's not a lot of credibility here. At the moment, unemployment or there's a threat of recession, the Fed's just going to cave and start stimulating again, and inflation will go back up. That's what happened in the 60s and 70s, and we can't have that happen again today.
I'm talking to Ryan Young, who's with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Let's get outside monetary policy because even me, it makes my eyes glaze over. Let me ask you about some other elements of domestic policy that could be affected as well. I mean, I know the Democrats like to paint this as the evil Republicans doing this, but when the Congress or states start to say, maybe we should have some work requirements for Medicaid. I'm not talking about Medicare for older Americans. I'm talking about Medicaid for poor Americans, or work requirements for welfare, for TANF, for SNAP, for food stamps. If the Congress or the states began to do that, could that possibly have a positive effect? In effect, that you're telling people, yeah, you may be on food stamps, but guess what? You need to go look for a job or you're off the food stamps. If we did that and got more people out into the workforce, and I'm not talking about retired people, I'm not talking about illegal alien children, which the Biden administration seems to be doing a good job of putting into our workforce. If we did that and said there are work requirements for all those benefits, we both put downward pressure on the benefits costs and upward income to the Treasury. Because I just heard the Treasury is actually surprised by the tax collections they're making. Apparently, they got caught off guard by that as well. So hit all of those if you want and set me straight if I'm wrong.
Yeah, work requirements and policies like that would help. The trouble is that the scale of the problem is so vast. A $31 trillion national debt, which is bigger than the GDP right now, and $100 trillion on top of that in unfunded liabilities from Social Security and Medicare. Tinkering at the margins with work requirements, yeah, it's better than nothing, but we have much more serious problems ahead, and that is where, frankly, Congress and the president need to turn their attention. Trouble is, they're not going to.
Okay, but other than monetary policy, if you were king at this point and you could make a big, bold move, what are one or two or three big, bold moves that we could do outside of monetary policy, outside of not shoveling out more free cash, that would make a big difference?
Safeguards against crisis. This is when bad things happen. The financial crisis gave us all kinds of bad new financial regulations. 9/11 gave us 2 wars and the Patriot Act. COVID gave us $5 trillion in new spending, big inflation. The bad things happen during crises. So I would have put in safeguards so that Congress, the Fed, and the president cannot freak out during a crisis and just go on those spending explosions like they do every time. That can't happen again. We can't afford it.
So what you're talking about is installing a backbone in the Republicans in the House of Representatives. Do we have enough money to transplant new backbones into all those jokers?
Well, it helps to dream big, but to answer your question, no.
I mean, they're going to cover gender transition, but we can't cover the cost of putting spines in the Republicans so they actually stand up for the right thing. Somehow there's something wrong about that. If the surgeons claim they can make a girl out of a boy, but they can't make a conservative out of some of the Republicans, we're in a sad state. Ryan, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lars.
That is Ryan Young, Senior Fellow with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Coming up, yesterday, a whistleblower testified that Joe Biden's government is acting as a middleman in a multi-billion-dollar migrant child trafficking operation. Is the big guy even aware about that? He's forgotten his own grandchild. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to take your phone calls and your emails. You know, for the last couple of years, I've been telling you that I think the Joe Biden administration has been one of the biggest aiders and abettors of trafficking of children and of adult humans as well. But the children is particularly worrisome. And I thought I'd let you hear some of the testimony that was done before the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, Integrity, Security, and Enforcement. And one of the whistleblowers from Health and Human Services is a young lady by the name of Tara Lee Rodas. She spoke as a witness. She testified under oath. She was detailed with Health and Human Services at an emergency intake site for illegals in Pomona, California, not illegals, but for all of these children, told lawmakers what she experienced on the ground. Listen to what she says about sponsors.
Some sponsors are criminals and traffickers and members of transnational criminal organizations. Some sponsors view children as commodities and assets to be used for earning income. This is why we are witnessing an explosion of labor trafficking. Now, whether it's intentional or not, it could be argued that the United States government has become the middleman in a large-scale, multi-billion-dollar child trafficking operation that is run by bad actors seeking to profit off of the lives of children.
Now, by the way, what she's talking about is sponsors. So if you have illegal aliens come into the country, a lot was made, and there were people who objected, saying, why you're separating these children from their parents at the border, when they encounter Customs and Border Protection. Well, come to find out that for the small number of kids that were actually tested, many of those kids genetically were not the children of the adults they were with. And if you wonder, well, maybe it was aunts and uncles or grandma and grandpa. No, it wasn't that either. These kids were being sent across the border, and then the U.S. government, what Tara Lee Rodas is talking about, is the Biden administration says, oh, don't worry about these kids. We've sent them on to generous sponsors who've agreed to take them into their homes and care for them. Well, as we've already learned in the last couple of months, some of those kids are then put to work on places like farms and industrial locations involving agriculture. So in other words, the Biden administration not only has facilitated the illegal entry of 7 million people into the United States, but when it comes to kids, the kids are being sent on to quote unquote sponsors. But what are those sponsors doing with the kids? And if you say, oh, I want to maintain my belief in the system, they're just being put in the hands of people who've agreed to be their mommy and their daddy, or to take care of them till they can be reunited with mommy and daddy. No, they're not. In many cases, those sponsors, as she said, are involved in criminal activity, and they are involved in using those children. And some of this stuff is so ugly, it is so grotesque, you couldn't really describe it on the air. But imagine children who are being used in pornography, or child pornography, children who are being trafficked for sexual purposes, and as I said, at the mild end of the spectrum, if you can call it that, trafficked so that somebody gets a full-time worker. The worker may be 12 or 14 or 16 years of age, but these are people who are bad people, and not all the sponsors are, but certainly the ones who do this, the ones who take advantage of these kids, and the fact that they're doing it with the aid of the Biden administration is especially evil, because Biden, at least allegedly, is working on behalf of the American people. He is not. And then you have kids who are put into a household who speak, for example, the Mayan language, when their sponsors don't speak the same language. Listen to her describe that.
I saw vulnerable indigenous children from Guatemala who speak Mayan dialects and cannot speak Spanish. That means they cannot ask for help in English. They cannot ask for help in Spanish. They become captives of their sponsors. I have sat with case managers as they've cried to tell me the horror of what has happened to children as they make the journey to this country.
Now imagine, what better slave, what better child for an evil person to take advantage of than a child that can't ask for help. So if you say, well, the child is being visited by officials from the government, either the state government or the federal government, if the child doesn't speak the language, speaks Mayan instead, and their captors, their sponsors, are speaking Spanish, can't communicate with the child, you understand that's a major problematic situation as it stands. And then Tara Lee Rodas, the whistleblower from Health and Human Services, who decided she felt so strongly about this, she had to take her case to the U.S. Congress to testify. And I'll remind you, she was testifying under oath, talked about something called debt bondage. Listen to that.
I saw apartment buildings where 20, 30, and 40 unaccompanied minors have been released. I saw sponsors trying to simultaneously sponsor children from multiple ORR sites at one time. I saw sponsors using multiple addresses to obtain sponsorships of children. And I saw numerous cases of children in debt bondage, and the child knew they had to stay with the sponsor until the debt was paid.
Now, I've told you earlier on this show that last year we actually documented on this show, we talked to a sheriff who was in charge. He had run into some slaves. And you thought, no, Lars, slavery went away in the mid-1800s after the Civil War. Now, of course, there were, vestiges of racist behavior and everything else. But slavery, there was the Emancipation Proclamation. And then I told you about the fact that because in America, the Mexican drug cartels have been running not just hard drug operations for fentanyl and cocaine and methamphetamine and heroin, they're also running marijuana operations as well. Well, how do they get enough people, workers, to work on plantations? And I'm not exaggerating this, I've got it straight from law enforcement, are in the hundreds of thousands of plants. I mean, no matter what you're growing, that's a big farm. So where do they get the workers? Illegals with debt bondage, where those illegals are put to work, they're barely fed, they're barely housed, and they have no way out. They're in the United States, and the reason that this sheriff that I talked to found out about it was a man got dropped off nearly dead in a local town. And when he was discovered, he was taken to the hospital. He was cared for, but he died. And the sheriff began to investigate. What did he find? In one occasion, he found a Mexican drug cartel was running a plantation for marijuana, hundreds of thousands of plants, 130 workers working that plantation, housed in abysmal conditions with no adequate sanitation, water, food, or anything else. And that's why the man died. He wasn't an old man. He was a younger man. But if you're housed badly, fed badly, not given adequate access to water or anything else, eventually you die. And what the cartel apparently decided to do with him is take him in before he actually dies, drop him off somewhere, and forget about him. He's just a slave. Joe Biden has brought slavery back to the United States. Hey, are you a small business owner who could use a few $100,000 and who couldn't? Employee retention tax credits, they're an incredible opportunity for you. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic, and Get My Funds has already helped out 1,500 small business owners. They got about $300 million in additional funding, and they know what they're doing. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for these credits, and they'll be with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. They stand behind their work at Get My Funds. They have an audit safeguard. If you retain W-2 employees during COVID, and even if you already got the Paycheck Protection Plan money, you need to call Get My Funds now at 800-535-2950. It's not a grant. It's not a loan. It's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust at Get My Funds at 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Glad to be with you on a Thursday. Always glad to take your phone calls and your emails. Coming up, if you don't like the politician who's now in office, a bumbling, stumbling vice president, for example, you can always vote Biden out. But what about the army of bureaucrats implementing their own laws and rules, and you can't vote them out? We'll get to that next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and your emails. Our good friend Seton Motley, president of Less Government, great organization, joins me now. Seton, how are you?
Doing well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, but I'd be doing
better than Fox News. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm doing better than Fox News. I'm still gainfully employed, unlike Don Lemon. I don't think Tucker Carlson is hurting right now, and it sounds like he'll be back on the air fairly soon.
Let's think about this. He's the heir to isn't the heir to some frozen food fortune?
Yeah,
what?
Chicken. Swanson Frozen Foods. Yeah, he's not hurting.
Frozen Foods. Yeah, Swanson. Yeah, the TV dinners.
Yep.
So he had that before he, opened his eyes. Plus, he's been on TV for frickin' 30 years.
Yep.
So if this guy doesn't have some money put away, there's no one to blame but himself.
Well, you know what? Since we got onto that, I love is there's a spin being put out right now. New York Post had the story that Don Lemon, who I think is an execrable human being, frankly, yes, not just based on the most recent description of him, but all the other garbage that he shovels out. But he said, I think I'll just chill out for a while this summer. You know what? I can almost guarantee you, Seton, I've been in the business a long time too, and I'm at a much lower level than either one of those guys, although I think on the moral plane, I'm higher than Don Lemon. But I have, for decades, had what's called a no-compete. Almost everybody in the business ends up signing one, and it says, yep, you probably have one too. And you say, what does that mean? It means that within certain areas or certain time periods, you can't go back to work in the business, even if they let you go. And I don't mind having that. But I have a feeling that Don Lemon is just trying to wait out his no-compete on the beach because he literally can't show up somewhere else on some other network, even if, God forbid, somebody wants to hire him.
Is his door being beaten down with offers?
I don't think so.
I'm not entirely sure that's the case. Now, Tucker of course, is a talented guy. We see from his, did you see the Babylon Bee headline? Fox News fires the one reason to watch Fox News.
Yeah, exactly.
And the ratings imploded, and it was hilarious. On day one, they lost more in stock value than the entire settlement at Dominion.
Yep.
That was kind of coincidental and funny. But look, I was on Tucker's show once, and I didn't go back because we debated the carried interest. And to be perfectly frank, I kicked his ass. But don't get me wrong. He's you've met him, I'm sure.
I've met him once or twice, and Seton, I always disclose my dog in the fight. I don't know him well. I don't really think much of the relationship he apparently had with Hunter Biden, which is troubling all day long. But I didn't have anything especially bad to say about the guy. As you said, he's very, very talented. He's actually been on this show, but has been forever ago, 15 years ago, probably, right, for a couple of interviews just to talk about issues. But having said that, you're right. He's the biggest draw Fox has. So they get, as I understand it, they gross at Fox News about $16 billion a year. Out of that, they make about $1.6 billion, and apparently the size of the Dominion suit is half their net profit this year, and the Smartmatic suit is likely to be the other half. And then, of course, they lost big time with Tucker going away. So I don't know. I wouldn't predict the demise of Fox News anytime soon, but this is a gigantic hit.
It's a huge hit, and I've interacted with Tucker on several occasions. I used to go play poker. They had Friday night poker games at the Daily Caller headquarters before they'd even called it Daily Caller. It had a different name, News Q. And they used to have Friday night poker tournaments in their headquarters on Wisconsin Avenue in DuPont Circle. They moved headquarters before they ever published. But he's a genuinely good guy. He's a very sincere guy, and he's going to do very well. Now, what I said right after it happened was, when O'Reilly got fired, if he took 10% of his audience to his website, he had 5 million viewers. So that's 500,000 at $20 a month. That's a lot of money.
Yep.
When Glenn Beck left, I said the same thing because I was on Glenn Beck a lot right before he went away. And if he took 10% of his 4 million, that's 400,000 times $20 a month. That's a lot of money. But what do you notice happened? They're not part of the national conversation anymore.
Nope.
They're making a killing, but their influence is dramatically less. Because I said there's only so many time slots on relevant television networks. There's 9 trillion websites. So, yeah, you can go and make a great fortune, taking your audience, even a tiny fraction of your audience with you, but you drop off the radar. I don't know what Tucker's going to do. I mean, what does he do? Newsmax only has, I saw the numbers, like 150,000 each hour in audience. Does he go to Newsmax and become the emperor of Newsmax? I mean,
no, you know what? If I were him, I think it'd be, and I'm not, and I don't have any special insights. I think it'd be interesting if what he did was say, I'm going to start my own platform. And you say, okay, that's a start. But if he could immediately bring, like you said, 10 or 20% of what he brought to Fox, if not more than that, to a new platform and invite some other firebrands to come on and with him, that could form a tremendous.
If he started his own, and I said right after Trump got the election stolen from him, yes, I'll say it. I said if ever there was a viable moment to start a third party, this would be the moment, because there's a bunch of Democrats and a bunch of Republicans that are sick of both parties, and Trump kind of straddled that line. And that would have been the one moment in time where it might work. Likewise with this is one of those few occasions, like you said, if he grabbed a couple of other people. When I ran the numbers, I think I sent you the numbers. It surprised me a little, just to show you how the landscape has changed. O'Reilly had 4 million viewers when he left. Tucker just had over 3, just because the landscape's gotten so scattered. I had a thought, I shared it with Mark Levin. What if you put Levin TV on Netflix?
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting
Isn't that
concept.
an interesting idea?
I'm going to let you go.
Now,
I'm up against a break, but I got to tell you this.
out of time.
No, but if you're worried about the prospects of Don Lemon, who also got paid very, very well for a very long time, the rapper Rick Ross has apparently offered Lemon to send his resume in because Rick Ross, this rap guy, has 30 Wingstop franchises, and he thinks that Don Lemon might fit in well at one of the Wingstop franchises. So
wait a minute, doesn't that violate his CNN chicken crap no compete clause?
I would think so. Hey, Seton, that's Seton Motley from Less Government. You got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to Lars Larson Show. Well, Joe Biden got caught because he got the question in advance, and now the L.A. Times and Karine Jean-Pierre are running for cover very, very fast. Glad to have you with me on a Conspiracy Theory Thursday. This one's just hot for today, but let me get into the details in just a moment. First, welcome to the best conversation in talk journalism. It's honestly provocative talk for the United States of America, and you're invited to take part. If you want to jump in, it's 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and you can vote in our Twitter poll. Here's the question. Should we require that all military vehicles be made electric by 2030, 6 years from now? Well, the Biden administration had vowed all the way back about a year ago to say that every vehicle in the U.S. military would become climate friendly, whatever that means. Well, now, Department of Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, again, I always like to mention that the young lady from Michigan is not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed, but she drives an electric car, so she's got that going for her. She says she supports efforts by the Biden administration to require the U.S. military to implement an all-electric vehicle fleet by 2030, saying, we think we can get there. I think that is catastrophically disastrous. A fleet of electric vehicles for the military. I guess they're not talking about a transforming jet airplane or bombers or tanks, but they would want to spend billions, probably hundreds of billions of dollars to make that transformation. And why are we doing this? Are we doing it to make America's military stronger? Or are we doing it just to satisfy the climate change crowd? You can find the question, should we require that all military fleets be electric by 2030? I'd say no to that. You can vote any way you like. At Lars Larson Show on Twitter and larslarson.com on the web. And always brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. It has the conservative values I believe in. I joined AMAC years ago. You can too. It's easy. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better. Better for you and better for America. Yesterday, I asked you this: should your child's elementary school cut out music class? I said no to that, and so did 93% of you, but let me explain what they're saying. It's not because of cost. It's because there are people who are saying that music class ends up being an example or an emblem of white supremacy, that more of the kids who are involved in music class are not people of color. They are, in fact, white people in the United States. Now, this music is racist argument seems about as ridiculous as anything I've ever heard, but that was the case they made. I said no to the idea. So did 93% of you. Now, your phone calls are welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. But let me tell you what I was getting at when I mentioned Joe Biden. Joe Biden doesn't hold very many press conferences. In fact, I think right now he sets the record in modern times for the smallest number of minutes or questions that he's ever taken as president of the United States. And there are a lot of us who deeply suspect that Joe Biden isn't really running the show. And then what happened was cameras caught a question on the back of a note card, a card he always has. It has a picture of a reporter. It has her name and her title, and it has the question that she's expected to ask. L.A. Times reporter. And Joe Biden was asked that question. In fact, the wording was almost the same as on his note card. And now the L.A. Times is scrambling to try to respond. Let me explain why this is so significant. Because I'm asked all the time when we try to line up an interview, and we do lots and lots of interviews because I want to bring good information to you. I want to bring you my opinion, but I also bring you interviews because I can talk to somebody who's an expert in something that I'm not an expert in, and then you can get it straight from the horse's mouth. Many times, if people have never been on the show before, or if they've never interacted with a reporter before, I've had rookie politician mouthpieces, not the politicians, but their press secretary, their press flack, say to me, can you give us a list of the questions you want to ask the senator or the representative or the governor or whoever it happens to be? I say no. No, absolutely flat no. Those used to be hard and fast rules for journalists. Now, did that mean that I never gave the person I was about to interview an idea of what we were talking about? Of course we would. We'd say, we'd like to talk to Senator so-and-so about his proposal to reform welfare or the military or whatever the subject matter was. We want to talk to the senator about solar power or windmills. We'd give them the general area, but the minute you start to give in to giving questions up front, let me tell you, two things happen. Number one, the person who's offering the interview can say, we don't like those questions. We're not going to give you an interview. That's number one. But number two, your freedom as a journalist, not so much the freedom, but the idea that I can talk to somebody, and when we invite them for an interview, and we say, we'd like to talk to you about illegal aliens coming across the border or child trafficking of children who are being brought across the border under Joe Biden's open borders plan, we say, we want to talk to you about this general subject matter. But if you give the questions up front, the person is free to say, and they do, they try this all the time. They'll say, well, the senator is willing to answer your questions as long as you don't ask about X or Y or Z. I am unwilling to give up my independence as a journalist to give up those questions. The minute I do that, then the person I'm seeking an interview with has some control over what I ask and what I tell you about. I'm not going to give that up. But in Joe Biden's case, the real question is, will the LA Times admit, did your reporter tell the White House, I'd like to be called on for a question? You may or may not know this, but when the president is at a public event, he's only going to call on a few people. Donald Trump used to call on just about anybody who wanted to ask a question. And he did this many times without any script, without any notes, without anything else. Now we've got the doddering Joe Biden, who apparently knows that he's going to call on specific reporters, and he has some idea of what they're going to ask him, almost to the point where the question the reporter asked of President Biden was very, very close to the wording of the question that was on Joe's note card. And yet you've got from Karine Jean-Pierre, his press secretary, who, again, is not the sharpest tool in the shed. She's not very bright. And I've noticed that over watching her briefings. She's almost incapable of doing things without notes, without a briefing book, without all these other things. She doesn't handle herself on her feet the way most press secretaries do. She is now denying that the president gets the questions in advance, even though the president was holding on to a note card that showed the question almost worded the same way as the question the LA Times reporter asked. And then you've got the LA Times today saying, well, we never give our questions up front. Wow, that is just an amazing coincidence that Joe Biden was asked a question and had a note card in his hand ahead of time telling him what the question would be and what the suggested answer was. And the young lady who stood up to ask the question, she just coincidentally asked the very question that was the question that was mentioned on Joe's note cards. If you buy what the LA Times is selling, and if you buy what Joe Biden's press secretary is saying, I think I've got a bridge to sell you too. Coming up in a moment, we'll talk about short barrel rifles, the ATF, and pistol braces. That's next on the Lars Larson Show. All right, we'll do all electric military on this one. Tell me when. No, there's a brand new rule by the ATF, which I agree should be a convenience store, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, but instead is a federal agency. And that rule requires owners to register pistols with braces. A brace for a pistol as a short-barreled rifle, but should those unaware of the change caught breaking the rule be held accountable in some fashion. Our friend Bob Barr, former member of Congress and former CIA analyst, and the newly elected first vice president of the board of the NRA, joins us now. And I got to admit my dog in the fight. I own guns. I'm also a member of the NRA. I quit for a while a number of years ago over a dispute I had with the NRA, but I've rejoined long since. Bob, welcome back, and congratulations on your election as first vice president of the NRA board.
Thank you, Lars, and we're certainly glad you and probably many, many of your listeners are NRA members who we need now more than ever to join us in the fight for constitutional liberties, particularly as we continue to have to fight the abuses by the Attorney General in New York, which has been ongoing for 3 full years now.
Absolutely. And just so people understand what we're talking about, if you're not familiar with the idea of a pistol brace, it was actually created by a man, and I'm sure Bob would tell us about that, who was either disabled or had disabled friends, and I think he was former military, and he said, hey, there has to be a way for somebody with disabilities to be able to shoot a pistol, and because of the kind of disabilities he was aiming at, it would be very difficult for a person, a man or woman, to hold a pistol, so he came up with this brace. It has since become very, very popular, and I frankly see no problem with having them. Why is the ATF going after this?
Well, in a phrase, because they can, because we have an administration which empowers these regulatory agencies to simply take matters into their own hands and define a pistol with an arm brace as a short barrel rifle and therefore subject to ATF regulation. They've done this sort of nonsense before. The problem with their view of the pistol braces, Lars, is compounded by the fact that over the last 4 years, I think it is, the ATF itself has changed its mind on whether or not the use of a pistol brace on a pistol makes it a short barrel rifle, or SBR. So if the ATF doesn't even know what it is, Lord help the unsuspecting citizen of this country who might have a pistol with an arm brace in their car and doesn't know that the ATF has again changed their mind on whether or not that is an illegal short barrel rifle, because the head of the ATF would not even answer a question when asked yesterday in the Congress, what are you going to do in those situations? This guy wouldn't even answer it.
Now, Bob, I know you know the law well because you used to be a lawmaker on Capitol Hill. There was an idea that I read about in the courts a long time ago called arbitrary and capricious. The courts don't like it when a town says, we're going to have a rule, but we're only going to enforce it now and then, because usually what would happen is they'd have, say, a vagrancy law or a transient law, and then it would only be enforced against the guy in some days gone by who had long hair, looked like a hippie or whatever, and so the sheriff would say, I'm only using it on those people. It was very, very subject to that kind of arbitrary and capricious enforcement. In this case, what the ATF's just described is they won't tell you what's going to happen, which means enforcement of it probably will be arbitrary and capricious. It won't apply to all the time, and it doesn't make any sense to do it that way. Tell me if I'm off base by going that direction.
Not only are you not off base, but it's even worse because, as I mentioned, the ATF cannot even consistently make up its mind on whether a pistol with an arm brace is a short barrel rifle or not. But if you look at these new regulations, it is virtually impossible to determine whether or not a brace that you are using or that you might have on a pistol fits the definition. So you have not only a situation where what the ATF is doing is arbitrary and capricious, but they are being arbitrary and capricious with a regulation with penalties attached to it that is so vague that the average person cannot even understand what it is that they are making unlawful.
Well, and here's the other crazy thing, Bob. They couldn't really write a law, could they, or a regulation that would say only disabled people may use this. You know, it would be like a law that said only disabled people can use a wheelchair. Well, does that include people who have no use of their legs, some use of their legs, painful use of their legs? I mean, lots of people use wheelchairs, and you say, okay, but who can use them? Anyone who wants to. Most able-bodied people don't want to sit down and use a wheelchair, but they could, and there's no law against it. as long as you're not defrauding somebody or trying to fool somebody, for financial gain, you're allowed to use it. So they couldn't really write that rule. So this affects adversely both disabled people and able-bodied people. Even if they figured out what they meant by pistol brace and what was included and how to enforce it, they then have to say, well, who does this apply to? And are we really going to tell both veterans and non-veterans who have some limited use of their arms and need a pistol brace to aim a pistol, and they have to then prove their disabled status to be able to use it, or pay a big licensing fee to the ATF? This sounds like both a revenue generator and something that's hugely unfair to a lot of people.
It is, and this is precisely why over the years we have court decision after court decision, and we'll probably have one in this case, that regulatory agencies are not in the business and are not allowed to be in the business of making laws. And that's exactly what ATF is trying to do here. ATF, which was set up initially to monitor alcohol during Prohibition and firearms, should be out there, according to its jurisdiction, catching criminals who use firearms. But instead, they have become a regulatory bully looking for ways to limit the exercise of Second Amendment rights by the citizenry. It is an agency that either needs to be completely disbanded and reformed or reined in significantly. But, of course, this president is going to do that.
Now, Bob, I want to ask you one last thing, and that is this. Just so for people who aren't familiar with these braces, I am, you are, but just so they understand, I have pistols, both semi-automatic and revolvers, wheel guns, and I don't think they're any more or less dangerous in the hands of a criminal. I think they're safe in my hands, but they're not more or less dangerous than a pistol without a brace. So how do they argue that this is going to make any difference when it comes to public safety? Because I assume that's how they justified it.
They are not able to, which is why the director of ATF yesterday, when he testified before the House Judiciary Committee, couldn't answer simple questions like that. What they hope to do is to be able to have it on the books for a while. It goes into effect the end of May, so that they'll stop people. People will get used to not using them, and they'll have a couple of examples, and they hope that that will, in fact, become the status quo. I don't think that they're going to be able to do it because there already are court challenges, and I think they're in serious trouble.
But otherwise, at this point, as we stand here today, unless the court challenges are successful, this thing goes into effect May 31st, and anybody who has something that the ATF could say is a pistol brace and a short barrel or a short-barreled rifle resulting from a pistol brace is subject to prosecution?
If they have not registered it with the ATF or disabled it or turned it back in, that is correct.
Surrender your property to the government. Now, anything about just compensation or due process in that to you, Bob?
No, it's taking property without any compensation. Forget about just or unjust.
I would think that a first-year student in a law school could probably walk into court, say, Your Honor, they're taking this man's property or threatening to take it or take his money, and they're threatening to take his property if he doesn't comply. That sounds like a taking to me. Bob, I appreciate it. That's Bob Barr. You can find what he writes at Daily Caller, among other places, and your calls are welcome. We'll get to a naysayer call right after the bottom of the hour at 866-439-5277. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and there's a subject I want to tell you about, but we always promise to put naysayers to the head of the line. So I'm glad to do that at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, head of the line or first in line, 866-439-5277. Let's go first to Chuck. Hey, Chuck, welcome to the program. You're a naysayer. What do you and I disagree about today?
I just heard you a little while ago talking about that you don't like to give up the questions you're going to ask to a prospective interviewee, but yet anybody that calls you has to give up their name, where they're from, and discuss their subject matter with your people before you'll talk to them. So it seems like kind of a double standard to me.
Can I tell you why it's not?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm all ears.
When you call me, you're already saying, I want to go on the air. when I call a politician, like a senator or a governor or somebody like that, and I say, I'd like to talk to Governor or Representative so-and-so about whatever it happens to be, solar panels, illegal aliens, whatever. In that case, the politician who both has a responsibility to respond to the public, if his handlers, and they all have handlers, tell me, well, what are you going to ask him? Give us a list of questions. And we say, no, we're not. Because he's free at the end of us giving the list of questions to say, well, if you're going to ask those things, the senator will not be coming on your program. I'm not going to give that up. That's problem number one. Problem number two is if I restrict myself to a list of 5 questions or 10 questions, then when other questions occur to me that go outside of those questions, then the senator can say, I agreed to answer only these questions. You're asking something else, and he hangs up. Now, that may tell my audience a lot. When you call the show or anybody else calls the show, do you know what the criteria are for allowing you on the air?
Yes, not to mention any other talk show and no foul language.
No foul language. We don't appreciate and I'll tell you why the other talk shows. Chuck, we're on radio stations all the way from Maine to Honolulu and from Fairbanks or Anchorage all the way down to Texas. And some of those stations run some of those other shows. Others, that's their competition. And it really creates problems, not for me, but for my affiliate stations. And I don't feel like creating problems for them that I don't have to. But the other thing I require of people, you have to be able to form a sentence. And like it or not, Chuck, and I'm not trying to be mean to anybody, there are people who call this show, and my producers like Dusty and Donovan and McKenzie will have somebody on the line who cannot form a coherent thought. And so you say, well, if you're going to get on and you can't even, because that's what I usually ask people, what's on your mind? I mean, that's a wide open invitation to say anything. Don't use the foul language. That gets me in trouble with the FCC, and they can find me more money than I've ever had in my life. And they literally can and will. They can find me up to, $332,000 per radio station times about 170 radio stations. I'd be broke even if I was Elon Musk could probably afford the fine. I can't. So when people say you're screening the calls, we don't screen for age. We don't screen for, and really not even for subject matter, Chuck. I may be talking about solar panels and you call in, want to talk about illegals. I'm very wide open on that. Fridays, of course, First Amendment Fridays, we're even more wide open than that. But I'm willing to talk to anybody as long as they can form a coherent thought and they keep the F-bombs out. And I've actually had members of Congress who've dropped an F-bomb in the middle of an interview on the air. And thank goodness we have the technology to keep that from going over the air, or I'd be broke and living in a cardboard box down by the river about now. So those are the only things. But you've already agreed to come on with me when you called the show. You want to come on. If a senator said, look, I'm coming on, why don't you give me a list of questions? Chuck, as a reporter, if I'm going to tell you that I've asked the relevant if you're listening to, and you clearly listen to the show, if I tell you I'm going to ask some great questions, and then I have to admit to you, but I've tied my own hands by agreeing that I'm only going to ask 5 or 10 things, and I'm not going to ask about anything else, even if it seems relevant. And having done almost 50 years of interviews in television and radio, I haven't done much. I've done a little bit of work for newspaper, very little. But if I've done all those interviews, I know that every time I do an interview, that a question will occur to me because of what the person I'm interviewing says. And I there's no way to anticipate that. So if you're talking to somebody about a particular program or some other, program in Congress or in the legislature, and they mention something and say, if we do this, we'll no longer have a need for that. Well, that's going to spur a question. And if I've already agreed not to ask any questions beyond what's on the list, do you want me to tie my hands that way in an interview?
No.
And I wouldn't be honest with my audience if I said, I'm going to ask whatever I want. And we don't, there are a couple of other rules we follow, Chuck. One is I never blindside somebody. I would never call somebody up and say, hey, we want to talk to you about the weather or the ball game, and then bring them on and then sandbag them by asking them about something else. I will always tell them the general subject matter. When Donald Trump's on, I ask whatever I want to ask. We've never had to agree to a set of questions to talk to Donald Trump. When I've asked for Joe Biden interviews, never get them. I asked for 9 years to get Barack Obama. I asked both when he was a candidate and as president, never got an interview. And now it appears that the people who are asking Joe Biden questions, it appears that that LA Times reporter gave up the very question she was going to ask. Because if you look, and feel free to look, there are photos of this note card in Joe Biden's hand. You say, what's the significance of that? There's a picture of the young lady who asked him the question. There's her name and her title. There's the fact that she's going to be called on to ask a question. And then there is the question. And if you look at the question on the card and then listen to what she actually asked, it's 90%. So how did Joe Biden or his staff manage to correctly anticipate this young lady is going to stand up and ask a question, and this is what we think she's going to ask? Do you buy the LA Times saying our reporters did not give up her question? I think that's hogwash.
Well, I think I just assumed because other shows do the same thing that you were doing it just to fill the questions so
Nope.
you could have your anti-aircraft guns
Nope.
ready to shoot one down.
No, you know what,
over the
Chuck?
roof you didn't like.
Chuck, it's not fun. I've been doing radio for almost 50 years. I have fun every single day. I learn something every single day. I'm challenged by people every single day. And you know what, Chuck? I love it. I mean, when I get done tonight, I'm going to get some, my little granddaughter, 7 years old, is over. Payson arrived a couple hours ago, and she knows that she has to wait till I'm off the air. Although she does sometimes come to the studio and hang out with me and listen on headphones and write me notes while I'm talking to somebody, usually naysayers. One time I was talking to a naysayer, and she writes this big note. She was angry because he and I were arguing, and she wrote this big no on a sheet of paper and said, "Tell him no." And she's holding the piece of paper up in front of me, and she's a sweetheart. She's a total sweetheart, but she is tough. But I love doing this, too. I mean, I love being with I will have to admit, I hope it doesn't hurt your feelings. I love spending time with my granddaughter and my wife more than I love my job. But my job comes, next in line. I love doing this. I wouldn't have any fun, Chuck, if we screened people out. And one of the first things I thought of when I started doing talk radio in the mid-'90s, I told my producer, I said, put the naysayers on first. And it was a young lady then, she said, that's crazy. Nobody does that. Everybody screens them out so that everybody agrees with the host. And I said, not me. Not me. If my ideas will not stand up to a challenge, then I should go back and rethink my ideas. If I ever say, well, I've got this great idea, but don't ask me any harsh questions about it because it'll fold up like a $2 suitcase, no. I will never do business that way. I never have. And naysayers always go to the head of the line. Chuck, thanks very much. I appreciate the call. We'll be back in a moment. 866, hey, Lars. Form a sentence. I'll talk to you. 866, hey, Lars. You got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. If you remember back about 15 years, Greece ended up in a major financial crisis. Now, some of this came after the Great Recession 2008, but Greece was in a tough spot. And in fact, it suffered, as I understand, the longest recession of any modern, industrialized country, not the poor countries, but the first world countries, the longest recession in history in the world. And it sparked tremendous changes in that country. And a lot of us wonder if America isn't headed for something similar to that, except that America is a whole lot bigger. Not too big to fail, but too big to bail out because there's nobody bigger than us to bail us out, unless, of course, the Chi-Coms decide to buy us outright, which I guess I wouldn't put past them. Nick Givas joins me now, who's a journalist and a reporter at justthenews.com. That's John Solomon's outfit, and a great read every day. Hey, Nick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Lars. It's good to be back with you.
Thank you for coming back on, but tell me this. Are we really in danger of hitting the skids like Greece did? Because the changes it brought about weren't just financial. They were throughout the entire society. There were a lot of people who left. The country had a tremendous hard time to recover, and there's nobody to bail us out.
Yes, it seems like we are. If we continue on the path that we're on, where we're borrowing so much money, and usually for programs and to pay for things that most taxpayers would scratch their heads at and go, what? We're funding this? We're borrowing money to fund this? And it's got to end somewhere. There's got to be, you're going to pay the piper. And it seems as if, I spoke with some experts at the Heritage Foundation, this might even be on purpose to pave the way for a digital dollar, which would be much more easy to regulate for the government to have central control over. And it's almost nefarious how much they've neglected to deal with this. Republicans, too, I have to say, that they had a chance to also deal with this, and they've let it balloon, and now it's on steroids, and it's not stopping.
Well, and Nick, when you mentioned the central bank digital currencies, it's not just that you can control the monetary system. If you don't want to go down that path, I'm going to go down it. It's easier to control citizens as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's I think part of the entire platform. When you're doing this kind of spending and you're just looking for clean raises without ever presenting a plan to deal with our fiscal crisis, it seems like it's on purpose. And it seems to be on purpose because, as you said, it exerts control over the populace. It exerts power over people that would otherwise have liberty and independence because their pocketbooks would be full. They'd have freedom to spend, to make their own choices, to make decisions, to not have to grovel to the government. But if you centralize this currency or you crash the dollar, that's exactly what millions of people are going to be forced to do, crawl on their knees to the government. And it almost seems like it's on purpose. And that's the sick part of this.
It almost sounds like on a big scale, Nick, we could end up, if you watch movies or read fiction books where you're in this place where you're all dependent on one person or one entity. And since everybody owes their allegiance to that person for their very survival, you'll do whatever they tell you to do. Is that the kind of picture you're drawing?
Yeah, it's almost, I say this a lot on my podcast as well. I called it Brace for Impact because it feels as if we're living in times that belong in a movie, that belong in some kind of Marvel film. These are things that we daydream about that are now happening outside our window. And this crisis, debt crisis, is just one piece of it. It's a huge balloon that seems to be blowing up that no one wants to pay attention to until they're forced to. And soon enough, if they don't cut a deal and start taking this seriously, which is still up in the air, then it's going to burst, and it's going to be very ugly for a lot of people.
Well, and let me ask you about that deal, because purportedly the Republicans will say, and Kevin McCarthy's taken a few victory laps, he said, we got this done, we got that done. But their argument is, look, we'll give them a raise in the debt ceiling, so no default this summer. We kick the can down to, I think, March of next year, right in the middle of an election year when most politicians don't want to do anything about anything because they're worried about losing their jobs. And then they say, but they've promised, cross their heart and hope to die, as I used to say when I was a kid, we're going to cut spending. And I don't believe them for 1 second.
Neither do I. And it seems as if we try to reach out to the White House to even ask, will you take this, what looks like a pittance of a deal? They're all celebrating this for McCarthy. And yes, I think it's a minor legislative win for him. It's one of his first. But it doesn't go nearly far enough to addressing the problems. So even if it were accepted, even if this deal were to be had, it's not going to stop this explosion of debt. It's not going to stop the path we're on. So like you said, the whole cutting spending, we're going to scale back government. I think that what we've learned from many decades past, the minute they get the power to spend, they're never going to give it up. And the minute that budget goes up, I haven't seen it scaled back in my lifetime. So I don't believe them either, and that's why I think it's time for more outsiders, people that know how to budget, know how to cut spending, and aren't just lawyers and talking heads, because that's why we were in this situation. We elected those people to lead.
Almost sounds like you're suggesting a guy with kind of orangish hair who knows how to make a bottom line and knows how to recover from bankruptcy and things like that. You wouldn't be going there, would you? Because I'm there already, but I thought maybe you were going there too.
To quote the show Justified, I don't care how it gets done as long as it gets done. And if he's going to be one of those people that wants to come in and try it, then let's do it. And if it's someone else, then it will be someone else. But absolutely, that kind of mentality, unfortunately, is what we need, where you need to start telling these people that we're on the brink, and you need to start looking at them. They're not holding debates. They're not holding any forums. They're admitting that the president's being given his questions in advance. We've hit the Orwellian 1984. I think we can safely say we're living in it. And we need someone like him, if not him, to at least have a microphone, have a voice to point out how ridiculous this all is.
Well, Nick, I realize that metaphors comparing to personal life are different, but when you have people who are listening to this show who may have gone through tough times in 08 or other times, it sounds like I might have lost Nick. Sorry about that, Nick. I didn't mean to drop your call, but I would like to see the government behave the way you do, the way I do. When you hit an economic reversal and you end up saying, well, what are we going to do? Well, if you've had a drop in income, you're not managing to make as much as you're spending, then a family sits down and they say, we're still going to pay the rent. we're still going to pay for the electric bill, but we're going to cut back the cable bill. We're going to cut back the vacation. We're going to cut back 100 other things because we have to. We don't have any choice but to do it. I got a question for you. Are you a small business owner who could use a few $100,000 extra dollars? Well, employee retention tax credits, those are an incredible opportunity for you. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out 1,500 small business owners to get about $300 million in funding. And they know exactly what they're doing. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing those tax credits, and they'll be with you every step of the way, even in the event of an audit. They stand behind their work with an audit safeguard. If you retain W-2 employees during the COVID pandemic, and even if you already got the Paycheck Protection Program money, you need to call Get My Funds, and do it now at 800-535-2950. It's not a grant. It's not a loan. It's a tax refund. And there are no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust at Get My Funds at 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Glad to be with you on a Conspiracy Theory Thursday. Always glad to take your calls. 866-HEY-LARS. Send emails to talk@larslarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find that at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and larslarson.com on the web. And please tell Alexa to play the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. Do you trust the public schools when you send your kids off? Now, I know a lot of parents have made, I think, a very wise decision. It was probably spurred in large part recently by the pandemic, but a lot of parents have said, I'm getting my kids out of there. It is a snake pit. Well, I hate to disappoint you or perhaps confirm your choice, but there are some schools out there that are doing things that are not just illogical, they're not just immoral, but they're just dead wrong. And I want to give you a very specific example, and I'm going to suggest to you that even if it already hasn't been raised as an issue in your community, it is likely happening in your community. So let me get to that in a moment. First, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. And we don't mind naysayers. In fact, we honor naysayers by putting you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You should send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. We tried to make that one as easy as possible. And cast a vote in our Twitter poll if you have a moment. You'll find it two places, at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. So, about the public schools. Hundreds of billions of dollars are spent on public education. As I remind people frequently, America funds K through 12, government provided for the most part, public education better than every single industrialized country on earth. Germany comes in second, but we are way ahead of them as well, and we're ahead of every other modern country in the world. So, when you hand your kids off to the public schools, there's an idea, a Latin phrase for it, it's kind of cool. In loco parentis, in place of the parents, it basically means that when you hand your kids off to the schools, they're in charge of your kids, but only temporarily. Then they go back to parents. Well, there are California schools that are literally telling the teachers, you must lie to the parents and we will train you how to lie. Now, if I make a bold charge like that, I would expect that you would say, well, Lars, you better back that one up, because that one sounds kind of crazy that a school would tell the teachers working for that school, you must lie to the parents about something significant that is happening to their kids. So let me back it up. There are teachers at one California middle school, and as I said, fair warning, this is not just happening in one place in America and not just because it's crazy California. The teachers at this middle school have now brought a lawsuit against their school district and the State Board of Education. It was actually filed today because what they've said in this district, school, in this lawsuit, is that two teachers, Elizabeth Marabelli and Lorianne West, one is Catholic, one is Christian, Protestant Christian, so they say that the school district is not only telling them you have to lie to the parents, but you have to compound that lie, because if a child comes to you and says, I am going through gender transition. So we're talking about K through 12 schools, all kids under the age of 18. That if the child says, I'm transitioning boy to girl or girl to boy, you have to call them by whatever name they have chosen and whatever pronoun they have chosen. But, and this is where it gets really serious, if you have this information in your head and you talk to the parents of those children, you must deliberately hide from the parents any information about this very significant change that appears to be happening in this child. In other words, the child says, I'm going from being a boy to a girl, and you're required to call that student she in class, and by whatever name they choose. But when you talk to the parents, you have to refer to the child by the original birth name of the child and the gender of the child. And here's what the lawsuit says. Under the policy, teachers must refer to students by their preferred pronouns or gender-specific names during school hours, but then revert to biological pronouns and legal names when speaking to the parents. The lawsuit says at Escondido, which is where the school is, Escondido Union School District, once a teacher learns of a child's social transitioning, he or she, according to the district, has an obligation to ensure the parents never find out. The policy states, quote, revealing a student's transgender status to individuals, and here's the favorite phrase for me, who do not have a legitimate need for the information without the student's consent is prohibited. This is a school district, a government agency, and that's important because governments are constrained by the law. They're constrained by the Constitution. They're telling the teacher, the parent of this child, who says he or she is going through this really significant transition that might actually include surgery, might actually include chemicals or, pharmaceutical products to halt their puberty, that the parents have no legitimate need to know that information. It goes on. Regardless of the student's age or circumstances, the policy says parents or caretakers are individuals who, quote, do not have a legitimate need for the information. Now, this is what's crazy. The district's own professional standards, which are published in the board policy manual, say, quote, being dishonest with students, parents, guardians, staff, or members of the public, that's a quote from the board policy manual, constitutes inappropriate conduct. That's in the lawsuit. Now, I'd agree with that. If you tell your teachers, if you're dishonest with the students, the parents, even members of the public who don't have kids in public school, that is inappropriate conduct for a professional. But under this policy, the district, and again, I'd remind you, this is not the only district that's doing it. There are many others in America, and I'll bet they're doing as much as they can to hide this from the voters, from the taxpayers, and from the citizens and parents out there. Under the policy, teachers will be trained to lie to what the district refers to as a suspicious parent. So in other words, a parent thinks something's up with my son or daughter. I don't know what it is. The only people, adults, primarily that they interact with are teachers and counselors and school administrators. Maybe I'll go to the school and I'll ask some questions and find out what's going on with my son or daughter. The teachers are then told, according to the lawsuit, to tell concerned parents, quote, the inquiry is outside the scope of the intent of their interaction, sounds like a lawyer wrote it, and that they can only discuss, quote, information regarding the student's behavior as it relates to school, class rules, assignments, etc. On one hand, the district is telling the teachers calling the kid by a different name and a different gender is part of your job as a teacher. So it is very much something that is involving the in-class learning of the student and the job of the teacher. And yet when the parent comes to ask about it, you're told, I'm sorry, that's outside of the scope of school, class rules, assignments, etc. They're telling the teachers to lie. And these two teachers, Elizabeth Mirabelli and Lorianne West, are saying, this is wrong. We're going to sue the school district. We're going to demand. Now, it sounds like if the district ever made an attempt to try to keep this secret from the people in that school district's population, whether it's parents, whether it's students, whether it is the taxpayers, whether it is the voters, no matter what class they fell into, this district is trying to hide all of this from the parents. And these teachers are saying, you are violating our First Amendment rights as a government agency to tell us to accommodate the gender change in class and lie to the parents outside of class. That's wrong, and I agree. Glad to get your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. I suppose I should, as I often do, start with a confession and naming my dog in the fight. Have I had bad credit during my life? Yeah, I have. There was a time where I was kind of slack about paying my bills on time. I didn't have great credit. Do I have good credit now? Yeah, I do. I've become more diligent at that. Plus, putting some things on automatic payment makes a lot of sense. Am I proud of the fact that I've maintained good credit? Yeah, I am. And I know that a lot of you are too, because when we heard about this news roughly a week ago, that the Biden administration was going to punish people with good credit and reward people with bad credit out of some misguided sense of justice, I said, we've got to talk about this, and we got to get an expert on. So Roger Valdez joins me now, who is director of the Center for Housing Economics. He's also a research fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Roger, good to have you back on the program.
Oh, thanks for having me, Lars.
Have I misstated it when I say that the Biden administration is going to work through the federal agencies that grant a lot of the underlying loans or the basis for most of the home loans in America by saying we're going to punish the people with good credit with a higher interest rate, in particular for buying a house, and we're going to reward people who have bad credit? Have I overstated that?
Well, it appears what's happening is they're trying to correct for some problems that are real, which is that the fact that black households or African American households do not own homes at the same rate as white households. That is actually true. About 72% of white white families own a home, where only 44% of black families own a home. And so this started a while back, and the effort, I think, was to try to correct for that. But this is a sort of a redistributive thing that ends up penalizing you if you have good credit instead of helping people improve their credit scores. And I think that's the real problem here.
I mean, because one of the things you can do, and it's a choice to do it, you can work hard, you can spend within your means, you can pay your bills on time, and usually in about 2, maybe 3 years of the outside, you're going to end up with good credit, aren't you?
Yeah, and I mean, I think those of us that I have the same experience you did. I had terrible credit in my 20s, and then it took me a while to dig out of it. Now I've got really good credit. And it would make me really angry to show up with my good credit scores and then someone tell me, oh, it doesn't matter anymore. We're not using those, or we're using something else. I think that the credit score is a motivator for good financial behavior. People, as they get older and their incomes increase, they really do want to improve their credit score because it's a measure of their financial responsibility and success. And so that is something that I think we want to encourage. On the other hand, there's nothing wrong with including other things in the credit score, like paying your rent. There's a company called Pinata that is set up a for-profit business around the idea of creating a reward system for people who pay their rent on time, for example. And rent is typically not reflected in the FICO score in the three main credit bureau reports. So there are things that this administration and that state and local government can do to help people who have bad credit or credit that doesn't exist, and to encourage them and support them as they do what everybody that's got credit has done, which is pay your bills on time and increase your earning potential and that sort of thing. And I think that's I think where they should be going with this, rather than trying to put their finger on the scale and charge more for people that have good credit, which is essentially what this plan does.
It also seems like a way, and before we get to some other issues, it seems like a way to discourage people from being diligent about paying their bills. I mean, because if somebody says, look, I'm going to pay my bills on time, I've got bad credit, I want to get good credit, I want to buy a car, I want to buy a house, I want to do all those things, the barriers are staying my way, I'm going to fix it. If all of a sudden the government comes in and effectively says, it doesn't matter anymore, you go, okay, I can go back to slacking on paying my bills on time. There's no penalty for it. In fact, there's a reward for it. Right?
Well, and it's even worse than that, because as I said in the post that I wrote at the Washington Times, there's a reason for assessing risk in an economy. You know, if you're going to be a lender and a borrower, the lender has to understand what is the risk I'm coming up against here when I loan money to Lars or Roger or whoever. And the credit score is a way of assessing that. If you get rid of it or you change it in a way where it changes those reflections of the measure of risk, it's going to affect the underwriting of the loans. And so the idea of changing that could lead to problems where people are getting mortgages that can't make those payments. And so that's another part of the problem, is that there's a reason to have assessment of credit and risk to assure that people can actually follow through and succeed at the mortgage that they're going to get.
Well, and what I think about, Roger, is my wife and I we saw a reduction in income in the '08 financial downturn. We saw a big drop in income, and you say, well, we're still going to pay our bills. There were a lot of people, even average income people, who said, I committed to this mortgage, I'm going to pay it, and they weathered the storm and came out the other side. There were other people who just said, I'm just going to walk away from my mortgage. I got in for almost nothing. It may have been a ninja loan, so I'm just going to walk away from it. And you say, well, I don't want to loan money to people like that, or if I do, I'm going to charge them more. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Whereas the person who said, you know what, even during the downturn, we made sure that we put paying our bills as a top priority, even when times were tough, and we weathered it through. That ought to be rewarded, shouldn't it?
Well, yeah, and it's not even if you're even, you don't even look at the moral side of it. You just look at practically. You're trying to make a decision about who to loan money to. The people that were diligent about paying their bills through a tough period of time are the people are going to pay you back, right?
Yep.
And so that's something that should be rewarded, and really it just is, because of the way the market works. But if you start messing with that, it starts to distort that economy and it creates some perverse incentives. And I think that the idea is there's things like, for example, people that carry a bigger balance. You're talking about the tough times. There might be people out there who encounter a loss of income, and they have a big balance on a credit card, but they pay the minimum payment on time every single month.
Yep.
Well, the FICO score shows that actually hurts your FICO score. So what I think, there's ideas out there that are like, well, maybe what we should do is give a little bit more weight to the people that, even though they have a bigger balance on that card, and but they hammered away at it, they make the minimum payments on time, consistently for a period of time, they should get some better. Their score should reflect that.
I'd go for that in a heartbeat.
Right, and that's the way you should do these things. But unfortunately, the way a lot of the resentment and the way that the bill was written, that originally supports this, or started in 2018, the study of all these scores. I think the result of trying to increase the cost for people with good credit and switch that around with people with bad credit sends the wrong signal to people. And it doesn't really help people, because if you can't make the payments every month, you're going to be in trouble. So what you want to do is build up people's financial capacity so they can succeed at that mortgage, become a homeowner, create that generational wealth, and solve the poverty problem that some families are in or have been in. But you can't do that if you just hand people a mortgage. If you start to obscure the risk patterns, that's not going to help anyone.
No, especially when you're saying if you've got bad credit, you may get as much as a 1.75% lower interest rate for having bad credit. That's Roger Valdez, who's director of the Center for Housing Economics and a research fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And if you listen to this show regularly, you know that there is certainly no regard and, frankly, no respect for the American Federation of Teachers and its president, Randy Weingarten, who has played, I think, an absolutely evil role in the lives of parents, children, school children in particular, and America's schools, using her position for political purposes to benefit one party in particular, and that would be the Democrat Party. And nobody knows that better than Aaron With, who is the CEO of the Freedom Foundation. Aaron, it's good to have you back.
Hey, Lars. Thanks for having me back on.
Randy Weingarten really has a lot of a mess to clean up, and it doesn't seem as though she's doing a fantastic job in her testimony before the Congress or her public statements either. Would you agree with that assessment?
That's putting it lightly. Randy Weingarten is trying to she thinks that we have no memories here. She tries to claim that she was the one trying to reopen schools, yet you and I spoke several times, Lars, during COVID about how her and her union was shutting down schools. That was her whole goal. Her goal was to keep schools shut so that she could advocate for her largely political agenda, and she used our kids and their education as leverage to go out and do that. It was completely sick, and I'm happy that Congress called her out, made her go and testify yesterday, and have some accountability for her actions.
I guess I have a problem with the whole idea of public employees being represented by unions anyway. And I know some of the people listening to this show are public employees and they're represented by unions and they like it. But I guess the trouble I have as a citizen is that, say, take almost any state in America. Figure out how many teachers in the state. You know, typically it might be in an average size state, 50, 70,000 teachers. Multiply by 1,000, which gets you the number of dollars that the union typically gets from its members. So you say, okay, the union in a state that represents the teachers has $70 million. And you say, how much does it really cost for them to represent groups of teachers and renegotiate their contracts? A fraction of the $70 million. And if you wonder, well, where's the extra money go? It goes to politics, pure partisan politics. And I think the numbers are right. North of 95% of it goes to the Democrats, who then go into the legislature or the Congress and say, we got to give the teachers more. That's a really troubling, not just troubling, I think it's a fraudulent arrangement to say we're going to allow them to be represented, gather up that kind of money, and then use it both to benefit politicians who then benefit the teachers. This incestuous relationship they've got.
Yeah, you articulated it perfectly, Lars. The Freedom Foundation did an expose a few months ago around the National Education Association, not Randy's union, but the largest union in the country. And we found out that they spent 7.5% of their budget on representational services. This is a $300 million plus budget, by the way. $7.5 million went on. 7.5% went on representational services. Over 50% of their budget was spent on political gifts, lobbying, and gifts to political nonprofits. So when you think about the agenda of the teachers' unions, they are not some trade association type group that exists to provide benefits to members. Their sole purpose is political gain. And that's what we saw during COVID. That's why the Freedom Foundation fights these unions so hard.
Well, and it almost sounds as though average citizens, parents, and the students or the children of those parents have almost no chance of beating that. You walk into the Congress, you walk into the state legislature, and the union's there with tens of millions of dollars it can hand out to the politicians, and the parents are there saying, don't put this disgusting pornography in front of my kids at school. Don't do these things to our kids, or keep the schools open, for goodness sake. And the union says, no, we don't want to. And the politicians know where the checks are biggest, and they're going to say, oh, I mean, at least certain of the politicians. Some will resist that. The Republicans certainly will, because the Republicans get, did you have a percentage of what amount of the teachers union? I almost have to laugh when I ask the amount of the teachers union political contributions that go to Republicans?
Yeah, over 98% of their contributions go to Democrats, and those that do go to Republicans are Republicans that they know they can control. It's a total disaster what they've been able to do by extracting this money from your everyday teachers. The example that she was testifying on yesterday was that she gave government unions in total gave Joe Biden $76 million to run for president. And then when it comes to writing the guidance from the CDC to, quote, reopen schools, which really meant keep schools shut, Randy was able to actually write the language that was then used by liberal governors across America as coverage to keep schools closed. While at the same time, we had conservative governors that did not listen to Randy Weingarten, they did not listen to the CDC, and we had kids that were far better off than they were in Democrat states.
No, and when you think about that, that works against the interests of parents, against the interest of children, but totally in favor. I mean, most unions would say we want our people on the job with a great paycheck and great benefits. Okay, I understand that's what unions are there to advocate for. But to say we'd like our teachers to get the paychecks and the benefits and they don't have to show up and work. She's actually achieved something that I don't think has ever happened. Not that it's a good thing from my point of view, but she achieved something that no other union, you never saw the United Auto Workers Union say, by the way, would it be okay if our guys didn't show up, guys and gals show up on the assembly line and didn't make cars, but you still sent the paychecks to them? I don't think any other union in human history has achieved that, have they?
No, not to my knowledge. It was right. You're right. It was incredible what she was able to do and the damage that was done as a result of it. But I think what we've seen in response, Lars, is encouraging. We've seen that parents have been voting for non-teachers union candidates, particularly at the school board level. We've seen parents also take their kids out of public schools where that's a possibility and put them into charter schools, or if they can afford it, private schools. And then we've also seen teachers leave unions at a rate that has never happened before. Over the last couple of years, hundreds of thousands of teachers have opted out of putting money into Randy Weingarten's union and the National Education Association and their union. They're putting $1,100 a year back in their pockets and out of these unions' radical political agenda.
And that takes away
their best days are over. Go ahead, Lars.
Sorry about that, Aaron. But that takes away a lot of the union's political power, and that's good. Because I'd remind people of something else as well. Not only did they leave the kids far behind, but many of those teachers unions went to their respective districts and said, we have fewer kids to teach, and that means we need more money to do the job. And I never expected any citizen, no average citizen would say, you mean you did a lousy job of teaching our kids? You now have a lot of kids who've been pulled out. You have fewer kids to teach, and you want more money to do a smaller job? I mean, I don't know that makes sense to anybody except Randy Weingarten.
No, it doesn't. And one of the examples that we can see of that is the unions came begging for money from Congress to reopen schools, hundreds of millions of dollars that they were asking for. And then when they got the money in the form of the CARES Act or the HEROES Act, I forget which one, when they got that money, they actually only spent 15% of the dollars that Congress allocated for them to reopen schools. They wouldn't even know what to do with this money if they had it, but they're always crying for it because they always want to hire more bureaucrats, more teachers that they can take money from and extort union dues from.
Well, Aaron, sometimes I'm accused of never offering solutions. Here's a solution. You got 85% of the money left? Run a summer school for every kid who's fallen behind. Give some extra counseling, not counseling, some extra tutoring. Mississippi has done that with a tiny amount of money, and they've seen gigantic results. I think Tate Reeves was absolutely right to do that. That's Aaron With, who's the CEO of the Freedom Foundation. We'll be back in just a moment. I'll get to your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. Send emails to talk@larslarson.com. And next on the Radio Northwest Network, tax dollars to promote private booze? I don't think so. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Are you worried that the FBI admits it conducted 3.4 million warrantless backdoor searches? And then when you find out that 1/3 of those searches were actually the wrong place. Not only did they not have a warrant, they went to the wrong place. Now, we're talking about a gigantic number of warrantless backdoor searches into Americans' communications. Let me get into the details of that in just a moment. But first, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to have you with me. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it happens right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And if you want to vote in our Twitter poll, you can find that two places, at Lars Larson Show, if you don't mind Twitter. Or if you want to go to my website, vote at larslarson.com. The vote counts the same. Don't vote like Democrats. Only cast one vote in the Twitter poll if you don't mind. But this warrantless search nonsense, the more I hear about the FBI, the less I trust that agency. And that's been true for about the last 10 years. I don't know that I'd necessarily go back before then, but it seems that the FBI has been engaged in a whole lot of dirty business for a long time, most notably in 2015, 8 years ago, when the FBI put false information before a federal FISA judge, the so-called Steele dossier, in which they lied on behalf of Joe Biden. They basically lied to help out Joe Biden, and they lied to help out Hillary Clinton. And this is just unconscionable. So let me tell you the evidence I have of what's been going on lately, and then if you want to jump into the conversation, you can certainly do that. Department of Justice Inspector General Michael Horowitz. Now, let me tell you, if you're not familiar with the IGs, almost every federal agency in America has an inspector general. Most of them have a number of these people who hold that title. And what does that mean? It means that there are inspector generals for the Pentagon, for the Department of Justice, as I said, for virtually every federal agency. And their job, even though they work at the agency, is to root out waste and corruption and other things and then bring it to the Congress and say, here's what I found. So in some ways, they serve the same kind of function that, say, internal affairs serves within American police agencies, that the folks in internal affairs are there to find out, are the police following the law? Are they going by procedure? Have they broken the rules? And are people getting hurt? Well, the Inspector General Michael Horowitz from the Department of Justice has now testified before the House of Representatives, before the Committee on Appropriations Subcommittee on Crime Fighting and Federal Government Surveillance. So we actually have to have an agency of the U.S. House of Representatives that's looking at the government's surveillance activities on American citizens. Now, if your reaction to that is, well, if you're engaged in criminal activity, maybe we should have law enforcement keeping an eye on you. Horowitz admitted to Representative Matt Gaetz that the FBI has now done 3.4 million warrantless backdoor searches of the communications of American citizens. Now, that should be stunning all by itself. The idea that the FBI, now, I could imagine circumstances, and I would give you as an example. If you found, if the agency believed that there were American citizens who were engaged in planning a terrorist attack. Heck, I think they ought to be going after Jane's Revenge and groups like that, the ones that have been setting fire to torching pregnancy resource centers, for example. I think back in the day, even before 9/11, the FBI said one of the biggest threats to Americans was domestic terrorism, most of it in the name of the environment. Groups like the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front, they were engaged in terrorist activities. Some members of those groups were engaged in terrorist activities. Fine. Do all the surveillance you want, but you need to have a good reason. So here's what Gaetz asked of Horowitz. I want to get into the 3.4 million backdoor searches that a ranking member pointed out in his opening statement. So all these members of Congress get their opening statement to kind of set the table for what they're going to do when they interview somebody, when they hear testimony from somebody like Horowitz. How should the public think about these? And here's what Horowitz did. He said, well, I think what we've seen in various public reports, and I'm limited in what I can say about what's public, and most people who testify to Congress on things like this are limited in what they can say. You don't want to give away the store to the bad guys. But he says, which I think is one of the issues, by the way, that's worth talking about transparently here. It's obviously very concerning that there is a volume of searches, 3.4 million, and particularly concerning the error rate that was reported on in the last 2 years in public reporting. Now, I'm not going to guess that most of the public reports on this subject tell the full story, because we may only know the half of it. Horowitz revealed an error rate of 30%, or about 1 million erroneous searches. He says, I'm not a lawyer, or this is what Gaetz said, Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida. I'm not a lawyer, not a mathematician, but 3.4 million, about 30%, you're talking about 7 figures, more than 1 million figures in error in terms of the searches. So the fact that we've given the FBI, this agency, so very much authority to go out and do these searches, and then the fact that the FBI has used that authority to carry out millions of warrantless searches, which, as I said, in the right circumstances, for the right reasons, if you're going after a criminal enterprise, if you're going after domestic terrorism, then in some cases, I could see that kind of search being justified. Say, let's take a look at the communications of these people. Otherwise, how do you catch the bad guys in that case? But the fact that their error rate means 1 million warrantless searches done by the FBI, not on foreign terrorists on American soil, but based on innocent Americans who've done nothing wrong. So ordinarily, if you're driving down the street and a police officer wants to pull you over, he can only pull you over and even stop you on the road if he has some reason to believe that either you're in some peril, something wrong with your car, or he could pull you over if you have committed a traffic infraction. He can use that if he has probable cause or reasonable suspicion to believe that you've committed a crime. Otherwise, you can't. I mean, police agencies in general in America are constrained by the U.S. Constitution, that you can only get a warrant to do a search if you can show reasonable suspicion or probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed. The fact that the FBI is doing, without a warrant, 3.4 million searches of Americans' communications. So your email, your phone calls, your text messaging, all of those things that you expect to be private. And you have some reasonable expectation, as the lawyers might say, that what you communicate, no matter what it is going to be private unless they can show that there was reasonable suspicion that you're engaged in some criminal activity. But as I said, there could be, and probably are, cases where you have to say, well, if we're going to catch these bad guys, these terrorists, we can't go get a warrant because then they know that we're watching them. And in that case, then you may have to do it without a warrant. 3.4 million and a million of them done in error. That is absolutely outrageous. I think the FBI needs to be shut down and reformed or something else. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network.